Chipping Norton rests high on the limestone crown of the Cotswolds, its lanes dropping away like old ribbons from the market square. By daylight, it is brisk and companionable. Bakers at their ovens, traders calling across the cobbles, the Tower of St. Mary's keeping time upon the town. After dark, the same streets acquire a courteous hush. The stone seems to remember more than it says. Footsteps echo a fraction longer than they should. A lamp flickers, though no wind moves. And if you stand quietly under the eaves and listen, you may discover that night here does not arrive empty. It arrives accompanied. So settle yourself wherever you are. Let the breath slow and the shoulders soften. Outside your window, the town's last doors are closing. In the square, a late pigeon adjusts its footing upon the ledge. The tower looks out across the rooftops, and the long fields beyond drink the dusk. Chipping Norton, like all places that have lived a long time, is speaking quietly now. We need only listen. By the time the last stallholder packed away his wares, a hush had settled over Chipping Norton that seemed borrowed from the old stones themselves. The market square slept beneath its lamps, and the tower of St. Mary's Church loomed high above, stern and watchful. Mr. Thomas Willoughby, a solicitor's clerk visiting from Oxford, had stayed behind after dusk. He was a cautious man, precise in habit and proud of it. With the verger's key in his coat and a ledger under his arm, he declared he would complete the parish accounts before returning to the inn. The landlord had smiled without amusement. "If you hear bells tonight," he said, "you won't be the one ringing them." The church received him like a deep breath. His lantern cast its narrow circle of gold across the stone floor, the air thick with the scent of wax and age. The pews crouched in rows like old men waiting for judgment. On a table near the chancel sat 3 donation chests, brass-bound and heavy with dust. He set down his satchel, opened the first lid, and began his work. The first chest held coins and buttons, the second, prayer books and receipts. He wrote carefully in his ledger, the steady rhythm of his pencil echoing in the stillness. Only when he reached into the third chest did another sound intrude, the unmistakable tread of a boot upon stone. He looked up, the pencil frozen between finger and thumb. The nave stretched away in shadow. "Verger," he called. No reply came, but the footsteps sounded again, higher this time, as if from the tower stairway. Another, slower, deliberate. "Verger?" he repeated, though he already knew he was alone. The door to the tower was half open. Beyond it spiraled the narrow stair, its stone hollowed smooth by centuries of souls. Mr. Willoughby held the lantern forward. The first few steps waited like a dare. A cold breath descended from above, smelling faintly of iron and damp rope. He set one foot upon the stair, then drew it back. "Not yet," he muttered, and turned away. His work awaited him. The pencil resumed its scratching. The sound from the tower did not. Then, softly, the rope near the west door stirred. It lifted perhaps an inch from the floor and fell again, as though testing its own weight. Mr. Willoughby stared at it. The coil shivered once more, then lay still. He swallowed, closed the chest, and told himself the night air must have moved it. But reason, as it turned out, was not the only thing stirring. Moments later, the noise returned, a shuffle, a drag, and something that might have been a sigh. The tower was awake. Mr. Willoughby took up the lantern, telling himself that London men do not fear provincial ghosts. He opened the stair door again. The darkness beyond was thick and upright. Each step protested as he climbed, not loudly, but as though unwilling to serve. A draught moved against his face, bringing with it the scent of wet wool and cold stone. The rope that ran upward beside the stair bore a fresh polish where something had gripped it. His fingers brushed it, and came away sticky with oil. Halfway up, he paused. From above came the slow creak of timber. He could hear nothing else, yet the air seemed crowded. "Verger?" He tried again, his voice barely more than breath. The stair gave no answer, but a whisper, a single, faint syllable, slipped down to meet him. It might have been a prayer or a warning. When he reached the belfry, the lantern's light fell across the great bell. Its clapper hung still. No figure stood beside it, no sign of movement at all, and yet the floor beneath the beam was darker than the rest, as though shadow had taken root there. The air trembled just enough to ruffle the flame. Then the rope moved, drawn tight as if under a hand unseen. Mr. Willoughby felt the heat leave his body. The lantern fogged with the breath of another. A smell, not unpleasant but terribly human, of sweat, tallow, and iron filled the air. He could not see a man, but he saw where one had been. A faint print of a boot in the dust, the shape of fingers at the rope's base. He watched as the rope lifted, fell, and lifted again. The bell gave a small, sorrowing note, too light to carry through the stone walls, but enough to make his heart tremble. He did not run. He simply backed away, keeping his eyes fixed on the rope as though it were a creature that might bite. On the first landing, he stumbled, caught his coat on the iron hinge, and swore under his breath. The stair seemed to breathe with him all the way down. When he stepped once more into the nave, his breath escaped him in a single, grateful burst. The church was silent again. He gathered his papers with shaking hands, closed the chests, and locked the great west door behind him. At the King's Head, the landlord looked up as he entered. "Well?" he asked mildly. "All counted?" Mr. Willoughby took the glass that was poured for him and stared into it. "Who was Mr. Joyce?" he asked. "I seem to have met him." The landlord's cloth paused mid-polish. "Henry Joyce, the vicar, long ago, hanged from the church tower for defying the king. Some say he still tends to his parish." Mr. Willoughby did not answer. He retired to bed, where he dreamed of ropes that climbed themselves. The following evening he returned. Pride, more than bravery, took him there. The verger handed him the key with a knowing nod. "Lock up proper," he said, "and do remember your manners." The church welcomed him differently this time, not as a stranger, but as a man who had already been measured. He set his lantern low, worked quickly and well, and did not look toward the tower. Yet as the last entry went into his ledger, a sound like a sigh rose from the stair. The bell rope lifted once, then settled. Mr. Willoughby stood still for a long moment. He felt the peculiar peace of a task finished under supervision. Closing the ledger, he turned toward the door. "Good night, Mr. Joyce," he said softly. The silence accepted it. Outside, the square was cold and wide, but it no longer felt unfriendly. In the morning, a letter awaited him confirming that his figures were correct and his diligence noted. He smiled at that. Before leaving Chipping Norton, he walked once more to St. Mary's and stood beneath the tower. His hand rested against the stone, cool but faintly alive beneath the sun. "Rest easy," he murmured. A rook called from above, and the bells, still as death, seemed for a moment to remember what they were for. Years later, in another town, Mr. Willoughby would hear a single, distant toll as dusk gathered, a sound so like St. Mary's that it drew his hand to his heart. He would not be afraid. He would simply nod, as one gentleman acknowledges another across a crowded room. West Street begins where the market square forgets its confidence. The open space of chatter and light narrows into a corridor of stone and shadow where the lamps burn low and the windows blink like tired eyes. The air carries the faint scent of wet dust and chimney smoke, and the cobbles gleam with the residue of rain. It is not a street that invites company, yet it listens intently to anyone who dares to pass. Mrs. Margaret Fielding had spent most of her life teaching the children of Chipping Norton to be measured, polite, and precise. She had retired some years before, but old habits die last. She still corrected the grammar of the greengrocer's sign and still walked as though each stride must count toward the lesson of a day. That night, she was returning home from a neighbor's cottage, the evening pressing in around her like an old shawl. A borrowed book rested neatly under her arm. West Street was the shorter route, and Margaret Fielding had never avoided a rumor merely because it frightened others. The lane greeted her with silence. A pale mist hovered close to the ground, gathering the light from the few remaining lamps and turning it into trembling gold. Doors leaned against their frames. A shutter clapped softly somewhere up ahead, then thought better of it. She liked the rhythm of her steps, regular, confident, the shoes of a woman who did not believe in nonsense. Halfway down, she stopped. It was not her decision. The stillness had decided for her. The air drew tight around her, thinning, focusing, as though the street itself had taken aim. Behind her right ear, she felt it, a small, exact weight of attention. Not breath, not touch, but an alignment so deliberate that it felt like a mark upon the soul. Her throat tightened. A pulse fluttered in her temple. For a moment, she could not tell whether she was breathing. She did not move. A teacher knows that silence can be stronger than panic. "Now then," she said softly, her voice steady and reasonable, as though speaking to a restless classroom. "That will do." For 3 heartbeats, the air held her still, its attention like a lens. Then, without protest, it let her go. A cool draft brushed the back of her neck, a ghost's apology. Margaret adjusted her scarf, drew in a controlled breath, and continued home with her usual posture, back straight, chin forward, as if she had dismissed the very idea of fear. At home, she boiled water for tea, wound her clock, and opened her borrowed book. She did not read. When she finally slept, her dreams were filled with narrow lanes and measured footsteps behind her own. 2 evenings later, she told the landlord of the King's Head what had happened. "Something aimed at me," she said plainly, "behind the ear." He nodded, polishing a glass he had already cleaned twice. "Aye," he said, "that'll be the shooter." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Shooter?" "The shooter of West Street," he said. "Been there for years, doesn't harm anyone, just lines you up, so they say. Folks feel it click, you can tell when it's you. And what does one do when that happens? You give it 3 breaths," he said. "Don't fight, don't turn, move your shoulder, not your head. It'll let you go." "They say it only holds the rude." Margaret took a sip of her drink. "Then it will learn my manners," she said, "and perhaps I'll learn its." A week passed before she walked that way again. The lamps burned lower than before, each circle of light small enough to make her doubt the next. The rain had left the cobbles slick. She reached the midpoint and felt it again. The faint pressure, exact and cold, pressing into the space just behind her right ear. Then came the sound. Click, metallic, tiny, inevitable. "You may have your 3 seconds, she said calmly, "but I'll not wait longer." She counted. 1, 2, 3. The air released her. She smiled, as one does when a lesson has been understood, and walked on. At the corner she found Mr. Jenks, the gallery owner, standing rigid with his face toward the wall, as though waiting for the stone to speak. "Caught?" she asked. "Every night this week," he said, his voice a whisper. "You're doing it wrong," said Margaret. 3 breaths, shoulder, not eyes." He obeyed, and the unseen presence melted away. He exhaled shakily. "You've tamed it," he said. "I've reasoned with it," said Margaret, and left him to think about the difference. In time, West Street became part of her routine. She took the lane often, testing its temperament. Some nights the air was quiet, as if asleep. Other nights the pressure returned, firm but fair. She treated it with patience and dignity. 3 breaths, a small turn of the shoulder, a nod to the dark. It always seemed enough. The townspeople, too, adjusted. The constable admitted that he had negotiated with it once, after feeling a strange chill and hearing that sharp, metallic click. Boys dared each other to stand in the middle of the lane after dark. Few lasted more than 2 breaths. Nobody laughed about it anymore. One night, after a late visit to a sick neighbor, Margaret walked home through a mist so dense it felt like walking inside a memory. The presence came earlier than usual, tracing a cold line across the back of her neck. "Not tonight," she said firmly. "You've had your chance." The pressure eased instantly, as though acknowledging her authority. She began to think of it less as a haunting and more as a lesson. The street was teaching restraint, perhaps even courtesy. It intervened when tempers flared or when thoughtlessness hurried people into danger. A cyclist once stopped there for no reason at all, seconds before a van came skidding round the corner. A drunk collapsed against the wall and woke the next day without bruise or injury. The lane, Margaret thought, was correcting rather than punishing. One winter night, she came across 2 young men arguing beneath the lamps, their voices brash with ale. The argument stopped halfway through a curse. Both froze, staring ahead. Margaret passed between them like a headmistress inspecting her pupils. "Good evening," she said mildly. The pressure broke. The men scattered. Margaret smiled faintly. "Well done," she murmured to the lane. "You learn quickly." The next day she told the landlord, "It isn't cruel. It's disciplinary." He chuckled. "You've taught it manners." "No," said Margaret. "It's always had them. I've merely reminded it. If you walk West Street after midnight, you may feel it too. The moment the air contracts and the world goes still. Don't turn, don't run. Breathe 3 times. Offer your shoulder, not your face. Then walk on quietly with respect. And if you happen to see a woman ahead of you with silver hair carrying a book and walking as though she owns the pavement, keep her pace. The lane approves of her, and through her, it might just let you pass." They told Dr. Arthur Selwyn that the rollright stones were best seen when the weather could not decide. "A sky that won't make up its mind is kinder to old things," the innkeeper had said. Arthur had smiled at the remark, approving of ambiguity in clouds if not in scholarship. He set out after luncheon with notebook, tape, and compass, his boots clean and his purpose tidily folded. The lane climbed through hawthorn hedges, the air cool with chalk and wood smoke. When the ridge opened before him, it did so without ceremony, and there, quietly waiting, stood the first of the stones, 4 upright slabs and a 5th that had slumped between them. The locals called them the Whispering Knights. Arthur removed his hat, not from reverence but to see more clearly. "Late Neolithic," he said aloud for the comfort of hearing reason pronounced. "Portal tomb, subsidence." The tape lay obediently along the edge, his pencil scratched its small, industrious notes. When he paused, the silence pressed closer. The wind moved in circular breaths, as if the field were turning its own thought over. A tap of wood on stone broke the stillness. A man in a shepherd's coat appeared on the ridge, his face lined by long weather. "You'll be counting then?" he asked. "Measuring," Arthur replied. "Counting is for superstition." The man nodded once. "Best keep to that. Counting never ends tidy here." He touched his cap and walked on, his stick tapping the stone once more before silence reclaimed him. Arthur smiled faintly. "They always say that," he murmured, and walked toward the main field. "I will not be counted by stories," he thought. "I will count them." The king's men, the so-called circle, revealed themselves without announcement. A ring of low, lichen-crusted uprights, none straight, each leaning into the next as if listening to a quiet speaker. It was not monumental, but human. A congregation that had mislaid its text and stayed for the silence. He set his compass, chose a start point, and paced. He kept the numbers under his breath. Numbers behave better when not overheard. 64, 67, 70. The margin of his notebook acquired 3 totals and a question mark pretending to be methodical. Then came the whisper. It rose faintly, low and layered, soft as many voices murmuring in sleep. Not wind, the air was too still. Not birds, they were too far away. It had the shape of speech without its words. He stood still, pulse measured, ears pricked. The sound shifted as he turned, following him, or seeming to. He touched one of the stones. The surface was cold and slick, faintly damp, as though breath had cooled there moments before. Beneath the lichen there seemed to be something steady and alive. He drew his hand away and laughed quietly. "Resonance," he said aloud, "an acoustic illusion." His own voice sounded strangely small against the waiting air. He crossed the road to the solitary kingstone, narrow and tall, standing apart like a sentinel unwilling to join the others. Its surface bore old grooves, some carved, others natural. He brushed a line with his fingers and found chalk dust whitening his skin. For a moment, the stone's shadow appeared to stretch in 2 directions at once. Rain began before he reached the inn. The landlord, a serious man who polished glasses as if polishing thought, set down a tankard. "You were up by the stones," he said. "I was." "They're best left to themselves after light fades," the man replied. "They whisper then." Arthur smiled. "I have heard worse whispers in common rooms." That night he dreamt of a circle that counted itself. The stones turned one by one as if conferring. When he woke, his notebook lay open, and along its margin a faint white ring of chalk had appeared where no hand had rested. He rubbed it once. It dulled, but it did not go. The next afternoon was leaden and still. He returned to the ridge with the resolve that sometimes hides fear. The king's men waited as before, but perhaps not quite the same. He began his circuit again. At 23, he distrusted himself. At 39, he distrusted the stones. At 64, the whisper came again. Fainter, but insistent. It seemed to rise through the soil, not fall from the air. Across the ring stood a figure, slender, unmoving, grey as fog. She did not approach or vanish, merely altered the air by existing within it. He blinked and found nothing there. The sound faded as if swallowed by her absence. He turned toward the smaller group, the whispering knights. Their 4 and fallen 5th leaned together with the tired patience of a secret too long kept. The hush there had a density that filled the space between breaths. "What is it you say?" he asked softly. His voice returned older. The answer, if there was one, came as a slow, measured sigh that rippled the grass, but not the light. "Enough," he said, as a tutor might close a lesson, and at once the air relaxed. He left the ridge by its southern edge, walking slower than the path required. "I have not been frightened," he thought. "I have been acknowledged." The difference pleased him, though it also unsettled. That evening, he found 2 more chalk rings pressed faintly into the outer margins of his notes. He closed the book carefully, the way one shuts a door behind which something continues to exist. He woke that night to a soft, rhythmic tapping down the corridor, wood on stone, keeping its own time. The sound drifted out, fading into an idea before it became a fear. He told no one. Silence, he decided, deserved reciprocity. On his 3rd visit, he took bread in his pocket, not as an offering, he told himself, but as insurance against hunger. The ridge received him with a quiet that was neither welcome nor warning. The wind traveled under the clouds rather than through them. He stood in the circle's southern gap, and felt the distinct sensation of being observed by something that expected composure. Near the edge of the ring, the grass formed a shallow depression where something had once been placed. Arthur knelt and set a piece of bread there. "For the birds," he said aloud, and felt at once foolish and strangely correct. The whisper faded to mere air. A rook called from the hedgerow. He smiled, and the world seemed, just for a breath, to release its hold. He made one final circuit, this time without counting. The stones kept their courtesy and stayed still. At the kingstone, he did not touch the hollow. He only removed his hat and inclined his head, an economy cheaper than defiance. Enough, he thought. The rest will stay unwritten. Back in Oxford, he wrote his paper with the careful restraint of a man determined to make the inexplicable sound obedient. He discussed geology, erosion, and the peculiar unreliability of numerical observation under conditions of fatigue. In a single footnote, he permitted honesty. The enumeration of the so-called king's men varies inexplicably, even under repeated observation. The cause may lie not in the stones, but in the act of counting itself. He did not return to the ridge. Some places, he decided, prefer their memories unrefreshed. Yet on certain evenings, as he worked in his study, a quiet murmur gathered at the room's edge, soft even, polite. He would pause, lower his pen, and turn his head slightly toward it. The sound would linger a moment longer before folding itself away, like a conversation in the next room when the door has been gently closed for your peace. He never spoke of it. But sometimes, in the margins of his work, faint white rings appeared again, paler than chalk, and unwilling to be removed. He left them there. A man who has been counted should not erase the mark. The market square of Chipping Norton is a civil place, even after midnight. The facades keep their expressions, the lamps hold their ground, and the cobbles, old bones in good order, offer a sensible footing to anyone who still has steps to spend. On some nights, the tower hums very softly, like a parent thinking while the house sleeps. On others, no sound is required at all. It is on such nights that the guardian is said to stand. Miss Eliza Cartwright, who kept the small bookshop near the corner, often stayed late to put the day back into sequence. She was not a fearful person. She had learned that a well-swept step repels more trouble than any charm. Her pleasures were unshowy: the smell of paper and glue, a straightened row of spines, the click of the door latch finding itself without help. She would lock up, test the handle twice, and cross the square with the sense that the town approved of her methods. One November night, fog lay thinly, not enough to explain anything. Eliza drew her scarf higher, nodded to the silent windows, and began her short walk toward New Street. Halfway across, she noticed the figure. Not skulking, not theatrical, simply present, as a lamppost is present. It stood near the edge of the square where the cartwheel ruts make a memory of old markets, wrapped in a dark cloak that took the shape of a person without fuss. The hood was up, but not to hide a face, rather to keep weather off the thought of a face. She did not stop. People who run invite pursuit. Instead, she moderated her pace, a small courtesy. As she came level with the figure, she gave a polite incline of the head, as she would to a neighbor seen from the side. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening," the figure returned, in a voice quiet enough that the square could keep sleeping around it. It was neither man's nor woman's voice, or perhaps it was both in sequence. She could not tell where the reply had come from. It seemed to have been placed gently into the air before her. "You are late," it added, not reproachfully, but as one might remark upon the weather that has arrived. "Shelving," said Eliza. "It takes as long as it takes." "Quite right," said the figure. "Mind the step. There is a small change of level near the drain. Visitors discover it after the event. Eliza, guided by the remark, adjusted her foot by a thought's width and found firm purchase where she might otherwise have misjudged. When she looked back, the cloak had become the night again, and the square resumed its ordinary ownership of itself. Over the next weeks, she observed the figure in passing. It appeared when the town had decided to feel older. Sometimes it stood near the base of the tower, sometimes by the pump, once beneath the lintel of the old guild hall where the wind arranged itself tidily. It never moved quickly, though the eye could not always account for how it had changed its mind about where to be. Couples returning late crossed the square without whispering. A lad, racing a bicycle where a bicycle should not be raced, found his chain slip to a halt of its own accord just before the corner. He walked it the rest of the way with excellent manners. Eliza mentioned none of this to customers. She kept a shop, not a club for tales. But she did say to the landlord one night, "Do you ever see a person wearing the square as if it were a cloak?" He nodded. "A guardian. Old families speak of it. It minds the place when it needs minding." "Does it belong to anyone?" "To the square, I suppose. Or to responsibility." She accepted this tidy explanation. After that, she noticed other signs of a watchful presence that preferred correction to drama. A stack of crates left carelessly near the curb had slid itself closer to the wall by morning. A bill pasted over another, the common sin of posterers, peeled back overnight as though the glue had rethought its loyalties. On market day, a pigeon with ambitions above its station chose not to land upon the cheese stall after all. At Christmas, when garlands were strung and the town's patience with cheer grew thin at the edges, the guardian's attention seemed particularly timely. A man in handsome boots swayed into the square with a declaration forming on his lips that would have been indelicate at the hour he had in mind. He froze one pace before the pump, blinked, and turned his sentence into "Good night all," which satisfied everyone, most of all himself. Eliza, fastening the blind within her shop, smiled without looking round. Not all interventions were so small. One night in late winter, with frost patching the cobbles like old lace, a delivery cart came too quickly down the slope. The driver, who had misread the hour in his pocket watch and his obligation to caution, found his horses take the corner a fraction wide. The left wheel lifted, intention gathering itself for a hurtful lesson. Eliza, only a shadow crossing the square at that moment, saw the cloaked figure step from nowhere into exactly the right place and incline itself very slightly toward the tipping wheel. The cart righted. The driver, pale with the mathematics of what might have been, removed his hat to the night and said quite properly, "Thank you." "You are welcome," said the air, which had already gone back to being a square. Eliza began, after that, to greet the figure as a colleague rather than an apparition. "All quiet," she would say. "For the moment," the answer would come. Or, "The wind is indecisive." Or, when hail jumped on the cobbles like impatient children, "We shall all keep our tempers." Once, in a dry month, she lingered near the pump and asked, "What are you guarding, exactly?" "The idea of here," said the figure, "and the good manners that make here possible." "Is that not rather abstract for a square?" "A square is geometry made public," it replied. "People need somewhere to agree about. I stand for that." Eliza considered this with approval. She had always liked things that held their shape for the benefit of others. In March, a stranger came, a photographer with a cumbersome tripod and the pleasant arrogance of one who will make a picture whether or not the subject consents. He set up in the center and asked Eliza, who happened to be crossing, whether the square ever produced character at night. "It produces what you bring to it," she said. "Try politeness." He laughed, exposing more teeth than wisdom, and took a long exposure aimed toward the tower. Later, when he developed the plate in a borrowed kitchen, he found that the image held a shape where no such shape had been visible to him, a darker gravity, like a coat hung impeccably upon nothing. He attributed it to process, because professions have their dignity. As spring lengthened and evening forgot to arrive on time, the guardian showed itself less often. Eliza slept better, which may be related. But on those few summer nights when heat lay heavy and tempers loosened, a folded shadow would be standing precisely where it should, and the square would remember itself. A quarrel would drop an octave and finish as a discussion. A group of lads would decide that the church steps were not a seating area after all. A visiting hound would sit neatly beside its master, while the master discovered, with gratitude, that he owned the dog rather than the evening owning him. Years later, when Eliza had let the shop go to a girl with energy and sound opinions, she returned to the square on a night that had not been invited to rain, but came anyway. She stood under the eaves and took stock. The town had changed less than it believed. She felt, rather than saw, the shift of attention that meant the guardian had come to its post. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening," the square said back through the shape it was wearing. "I have retired," she confessed. "You have not," it said. "You have altered your duties." "Quite right," said Eliza. She crossed to the pump with the steady care of an old hand using steps she herself had polished. She did not stumble on the change of level near the drain. People watching from windows, if any had been awake, would have observed nothing to remark upon and would have slept a little better for it. If you find yourself late in Chipping Norton when the square has decided to be ancient, you may see a fold of darkness standing where a person might stand to be useful. Do not challenge it, do not bow. Keep your hands where your good sense keeps them, and walk as though your feet understood the design of the place. If advice is offered, mind the step, or try the other way. Accept it. You will reach your door with your dignity improved. And if, after you have gone in, you think you hear the faintest sound of a cloak settling into its own arrangement, that will only be the square putting itself to rights for the next person who needs it. So the town returns to itself. The tower breathes, the square arranges its edges, and the lanes stretch quietly toward morning. Chipping Norton has not tried to frighten you. It has tried in its way to teach you the character of a place that keeps its promises even after midnight. A vicar who minds his parish, stones that whisper without judgment, a coach that keeps to its time, and a cloaked guardian who watches so that strangers may safely become neighbors. If you slept along the way, you missed nothing. The town kept its place, and the stories kept yours. Now let the breath lengthen. Imagine the stones above the ridge counting gently in the dark, and the square resting under its cloak. When daylight comes, you may carry something of their manners with you. A steadiness, perhaps, or the instinct to stand aside at the right moment. Sleep well, and let the town keep watch a little longer. Please subscribe to this channel to be alerted to the next episode of Ghosts of the Cotswolds.